In a city of metallic shadows, the truth is often hidden behind a polished surface of lies and high-tech deception. We peel back the layers to show you the raw human emotions that drive the world forward. Click subscribe now and see through the darkness with our cinematic lens. The August heat in Nashville sits on your chest like something alive. I noticed it especially that Tuesday afternoon when I turned my key in the back door of my own house and stepped into a kitchen that felt wrong before I could explain why. Nothing dramatic. No broken glass. No overturned chairs. Just a feeling. The way an old dog lifts its nose and knows something has shifted in the air. I set my grocery bag on the counter and stood still, letting my eyes do the work they'd spent 31 years doing. I had spent 3 decades as a forensic accountant for the federal government, and if that career taught me one thing above all others, it was this. The most dangerous lies are the ones that almost look like the truth. The mail on the kitchen table had been sorted. I never sort my mail. I set it down in a pile and deal with it when I feel like it, usually after dinner. But now it was arranged in a neat stack, envelopes aligned, the electric bill sitting on top. Someone had gone through it and put it back in an order that felt organized but wasn't mine. I walked to my home office at the end of the hall. The filing cabinet in the corner, the one I kept locked, had a fresh hairline scratch along the bottom of the keyhole. Shallow. The kind you leave when you're working with something thin and careful. Amateur work, but not careless. Patient. My hands didn't shake. I'd spent too many years reviewing falsified ledgers and reconstructed wire transfers to fall apart at the first sign of trouble. Instead, I sat down in my chair, folded my hands on the desk, and thought through what I already knew. My son-in-law had been staying with me for 6 weeks. He and my daughter had asked to move in temporarily after their apartment lease ended, just until they found something permanent. I'd said yes without thinking twice. My daughter was my daughter. The house was 4 bedrooms, and I was alone in it. Of course I said yes, but I'd caught small things. My son-in-law on the phone late at night, voice low, stepping out to the back porch when he heard me coming down the stairs. My daughter asking questions about my retirement accounts that she'd framed as casual curiosity. A real estate listing left open on the laptop in the living room, my home address in the search bar, and both of them going quiet when I walked in. The house was worth a lot. 3 bedrooms, 2-car garage, nearly half an acre in a part of East Nashville that had tripled in value over the past decade. My wife and I had bought it in 1987 for what now felt like the cost of a decent used car. She passed 4 years ago, and the house had been mine alone since then. Mine and everything I'd built in it. I looked at the scratch on the filing cabinet for a long moment. Then I went to the kitchen and started dinner, talking pleasantly when my son-in-law came in from the garage, asking about his day, watching his eyes. He was good, but he wasn't 31 years of federal investigations good. That night at dinner, my daughter set down her fork and said they'd been doing some research. Estate planning, she called it. For my benefit, she said. To protect me. She'd heard that without a clear power of attorney, things could get complicated. She smiled when she said it. The same smile I'd watched her practice since she was 9 years old. I told her I'd think about it. I spent that night lying on top of the covers in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan and doing what I'd always done when I needed to think. I made a list. Not on paper. In my head, the way you do when you've worked with sensitive documents long enough that you stop trusting paper to stay where you put it. Motive. The house. The accounts. Probably the life insurance policy on file in that cabinet. Opportunity. They were living under my roof. Method. A forged power of attorney. Or worse, a guardianship petition built on a manufactured narrative of cognitive decline. That last part was the one that made my jaw tighten, because I'd seen it done before. In case files that crossed my desk over the years, families turning an aging parent's small confusions into a legal weapon. I wasn't confused. I wasn't declining. But I also knew that it didn't matter what I knew about myself. It mattered what I could prove. The next morning I told them over breakfast that I'd been thinking about taking a trip. My buddy from my old office, I said, had a lake house up in Kentucky. I hadn't been up there in years. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3. I hadn't decided. My son-in-law's expression didn't change, but his coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth for just a fraction of a second. That fraction told me everything. My daughter said it sounded wonderful, that I deserved some rest, that they would take good care of things while I was gone. I said I appreciated that. I spent 2 days making it look real. I called my neighbor across the street, a woman named Ruth, who'd lived there for 22 years, who'd helped carry in groceries when my wife was sick and had never once asked for anything in return. I told her the outline of what I was thinking. Not everything, just enough. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she'd seen her own brother do something similar to their mother 15 years ago. She didn't say anything else about it, but she looked at me the way people look at you when they're finished talking and ready to work. On the morning I left, I loaded my truck in full view of the front window. I moved slowly, took my time, let them watch me pack the fishing gear and the small, soft-sided cooler. My son-in-law came out to help with the heavier items. I let him. His movements were stiff with a kind of barely managed eagerness, the posture of a man trying not to look like he's counting down. When everything was loaded, I turned to face him, and I held out my hand and he shook it, and I held the grip a second longer than necessary, and he looked away first. My daughter kissed my cheek in the doorway. Her perfume was new. I filed that away. I backed out of the driveway. They stood together on the front steps and waved. In my rearview mirror, I watched their faces change the moment they thought I was far enough gone. My daughter leaned into my son-in-law and said something close to his ear. He laughed. I drove to the end of the block, turned right, and kept going, but not toward Kentucky. 40 minutes east, there was a budget motel just off the interstate, the kind that asked for cash and didn't require much conversation. I checked in, found my room, and sat on the edge of the bed until it got dark. I didn't turn on the television. I sat in the quiet and let the stillness do what it always did when I needed to think clearly, which was to burn off everything that wasn't useful until only the facts remained. I drove back after midnight, parked 2 streets over, under a row of old elm trees, walked the long way around through the alley. Ruth's back porch light was on, which was the signal we'd arranged, which meant she had something to tell me. She was waiting just inside her screen door. She handed me a mug of coffee without asking and showed me her phone. She'd been watching from her front window with the lights off, the way she'd apparently been doing for years out of simple habit. A man in a sport coat had arrived at my front door at 9 o'clock that evening, stayed for almost 2 hours. She'd photographed him from her porch through a long lens she dug out of a closet, one she used for bird watching. The photos were clear enough. I studied the face. Mid-50s. Briefcase. The practiced ease of someone who'd had many living room conversations about other people's property. "Do you know him?" she asked. I told her I intended to find out. I had her walk me through everything she'd seen over the past 6 weeks. She had been watching, quietly and without drama, the way retired school teachers sometimes do when they sense something going wrong in their neighborhood. She'd kept notes in a yellow legal pad. Dates, times, descriptions. 2 previous visits from the man in the sport coat. A second man, younger, who'd come twice on weekday afternoons and carried a portfolio under his arm. Several late-night phone calls my son-in-law had taken out in the driveway, pacing back and forth in the yellow porch light. I looked at her notes for a long time. Then I said, "I need to get back inside my own house." She said she knew that. She said she'd keep watch. The second Tuesday, I drove back to Nashville while they were both out and let myself in through the garage door with a code they didn't know I'd changed. I moved through the kitchen and down the hall and into my office. The filing cabinet had been fully opened at some point since I left the lock. Showed wear that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. The folders inside looked undisturbed if you didn't know how I organized them, but I did. My retirement account statements were out of alphabetical order. The folder labeled with my wife's name had been pulled forward and replaced at a slightly different angle. In the drawer of the small desk they'd set up in the guest room, the one they were using as a workspace, I found a folder I didn't recognize. Pale blue. I opened it at the desk. Inside was a power of attorney document dated 5 months ago. My signature at the bottom. Except I had never signed any such document. I'd authenticated thousands of signatures in my career, reviewed forgeries that had fooled 3 different banks. I studied this one for 60 seconds and found 4 points of failure. The ink distribution on the loop of my capital G, the pressure inconsistency on the final stroke of my last name, a notary stamp that was slightly off register, the kind of small alignment error that shows up when someone runs a stamp over a document rather than pressing it flat, and the date, written in a hand that was trying too hard to match my own, with a slight forward lean I'd never used in my life. I photographed every page, every angle. Then I kept looking. Behind the blue folder, paperclipped to a printed email thread, was something I hadn't expected. I read it once. Then I read it again more slowly. The way you do when your brain refuses to process a thing the first time. My daughter was writing to a man in Atlanta. The emails went back 8 months. The plan, laid out in plain language across a dozen messages, was to complete the sale of the house and split the proceeds. But the split wasn't equal, and it wasn't with my son-in-law. My son-in-law's share, according to one message dated 6 weeks ago, would be handled separately. He still thinks it's going into a joint account, she'd written. He'll figure it out after. I stood in the guest room of my own house for a moment with that piece of paper in my hand. It's a strange thing, to feel sorry for a man who has been trying to rob you. But that's what I felt. Briefly, my son-in-law was being used as the means and the fall guy at once, a tool she intended to discard the moment the money was in motion. It didn't excuse him. He had broken into my filing cabinet and put his name on a forged document. But it complicated the picture in a way I needed to understand fully before I made a move. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, drove back to the motel, called Ruth from the parking lot. She said nothing had happened while I was gone, but the man in the sport coat had called my son-in-law twice that afternoon. She'd seen it through her window, his reaction to both calls, the way he paced and ran a hand through his hair. I said, "I need his name." She said she already had it. She'd written down his license plate during his first visit out of old habit, the way she'd learned to do years ago when there'd been a series of break-ins on the block. She'd had her grandson run it through a database he used for his work. The man's name was Garrett Fowler, licensed real estate broker, Williamson County. I lay on the motel bed that night with my notes spread across the coverlet and did what I had done with every complex case in 31 years. I built the architecture of it from the outside in. I knew the players, the documents, the forged instrument, the intended transaction, the third party in Atlanta, the timeline, and the cover story they planned to use if challenged, a cover story that would hinge on my mental state, because they were already building that. I'd heard it in small ways before I left. My son-in-law mentioning at dinner that I'd seemed forgetful lately. My daughter suggesting gently that I'd repeated a story twice in 1 week. These were the first bricks of a wall they intended to hide behind if anything went sideways. The confused old man who didn't understand what he'd signed. The aging father who couldn't be expected to recall the details. 31 years of watching people construct defenses told me exactly what this meant. They were not confident that the forgery would hold. They were building a fallback. That fallback was a mistake on their part, because building it required them to say things. And things that are said can be recorded. I drove back on a Thursday. Walked in through the front door with my bag, moved slowly. Told them the fishing had been poor, and the heat had gotten to me. My daughter made a fuss. My son-in-law offered to carry my bag. I let him. That evening at dinner I let myself look uncertain when my son-in-law brought up the estate planning conversation again. I hesitated on words. I touched my temple once. I said I couldn't quite remember what we'd discussed before I left. He and my daughter exchanged a look across the table, quick and loaded, and my phone was in my pocket recording every sound in the room. Over the next 3 evenings, I collected what I needed. My daughter explaining to me, slowly and with exaggerated patience, that I had already signed papers giving my son-in-law authority to help manage my finances. My son-in-law confirming it. Both of them on the second night, in the hallway outside my bedroom, voices low, saying that if I pushed back, they would simply say I was in the early stages of something and hadn't understood what I'd agreed to. His voice steady, her voice certain. I lay in my bed and listened to the recording play back through my earpiece, and I made a decision. Not an emotional one, a strategic one. The following morning I drove to the office of a downtown Nashville attorney I had known professionally for many years, a woman who had built her practice on estate fraud and elder financial abuse cases. I laid the full file on her conference table, the photographs, the forged power of attorney with my 4-point annotation of its failures, the email thread between my daughter and the man in Atlanta, the audio recordings from my own dining room and hallway, and Ruth's handwritten log of 6 weeks of observations. She read through it without speaking for a long time. When she looked up, she said, "I want you to understand what pursuing this will mean." I told her I understood what it meant. She said, "I'm going to need 3 days to do this properly." I said, "Take 4. She filed for an emergency protective order on my property through the Davidson County Register. She attached a signed declaration from me attesting to the forged instrument and its specific technical failures, supported by my professional credentials and 31 years of documented forensic work. She flagged the transaction to Garrett Fowler's licensing board. She also sent a formal cease and desist to the buyer in Atlanta, who, it turned out, had no idea the seller of record was not the actual property owner, and responded within 6 hours through his own attorney, expressing serious concern about the nature of the transaction he'd nearly entered. And then we waited. The closing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at a title company on West End Avenue. I knew the date because I had found the appointment on a printed confirmation in the blue folder, tucked behind the emails. 3 weeks out, we let it approach. I spent those 3 weeks living in my house, being exactly who I had always been, watching them move through the rooms with increasing confidence as the date drew closer. My son-in-law stopped being careful about his phone calls. My daughter stopped pretending the conversations I walked in on had been about something else. They thought they were close enough to the finish line that the small precautions no longer mattered. They had no idea that while they were becoming less careful, I was becoming more precise. The night before the closing, I sat in my office alone and went through the complete file one final time, the way I had reviewed case files before federal hearings, page by page, every item in its designated order, every piece of documentation cross-referenced with every other. Then I packed everything into a hard-sided briefcase, locked it, and set it by the door. I slept well. That surprised me slightly, but it shouldn't have. I had done this before, in the sense that mattered. I had built a case so thorough that there was nowhere for the truth to go except where I directed it. In the morning, I dressed in the charcoal suit I'd worn to federal depositions. I came downstairs to find my daughter pouring coffee. She told me I looked nice. She asked if I had plans. I told her I had a few errands to run. She said to be careful in the heat. I drove to my attorney's office first. We drove together from there to the title company, arriving 12 minutes before the scheduled time. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see them already assembled. My son-in-law and daughter on one side of the table, dressed up, sitting very straight. Garrett Fowler at the head of the table, arranging documents with practiced efficiency. The buyer from Atlanta on the other side, silver-haired, impatient-looking, a man who had paid for a plane ticket and taken a morning off work for what he believed was a routine residential closing. The title officer at the end, reviewing her paperwork. My attorney put her hand on the door handle and looked at me. I nodded once. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when someone unexpected walks in. I watched my son-in-law's face move through 3 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. I watched my daughter go very still. Garrett Fowler looked at me with the careful neutrality of someone recalculating. I walked to the empty end of the table, set my briefcase down, opened it with a click. That was the only sound in the room. I said, "My name is Robert Calloway. I am the owner of the property at issue in this transaction. This closing cannot proceed." My son-in-law said my name. His voice had gone thin. I didn't look at him. I addressed the title officer directly. I placed the first document in front of her, a certified copy of the emergency protective order. She picked it up and began reading. My attorney set the second document beside it. A notarized declaration from the Davidson County Register's office confirming that the property in question was under active legal protection and that any transfer instruments executed within the prior 6 months would require independent verification. The buyer stood up. He looked at Fowler. He said he'd been told the documentation was clean. Fowler said there must have been a misunderstanding. My attorney said, "The power of attorney on which this transaction is based is a forgery." She opened her own folder. "We have a written analysis of 4 separate authentication failures prepared by a 31-year federal forensic professional." She slid it across to the title officer. "We also have recorded audio of the property owner's family members explicitly stating their intent to represent him as cognitively impaired in the event the forgery was challenged." She pressed play. The room listened to my son-in-law's voice coming out of a small speaker. His voice in my hallway. "If he pushes back, we just say he didn't understand what he agreed to." Then my daughter's voice, clear as a bell. "He won't remember it differently." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't invite anyone to fill it. I opened the next folder. Photographs. Time-stamped. The conference through my own living room window. Garrett Fowler at my dining room table, reviewing documents from my private files. My daughter presenting a folder she had removed from a locked cabinet. Close-up of the blue folder in the guest room drawer. In context, undisturbed. Then the email thread. I slid a copy to the buyer's side of the table without comment. He read the first page. He sat back down. Slowly, he looked at my daughter. He said, "You told this man you were splitting proceeds with someone in Atlanta without his knowledge." My daughter's hands were flat on the table. She didn't answer. My son-in-law turned to look at her. Whatever he'd expected today, it wasn't this. He said her name as a question. She didn't look at him. I addressed the title officer. I said, "I understand you are legally obligated to suspend this transaction and report suspected fraud to the appropriate authorities. I want you to know I will cooperate fully with any investigation. I have already been in contact with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission regarding Mr. Fowler's license status." Fowler said, "I was provided documentation I had every reason to believe was legitimate." My attorney said, "Your due diligence requirements include a title search, which would have revealed a pending protective order. We'll discuss what you knew and when at the appropriate venue." The buyer picked up his phone. He said, "I need to call my attorney." He looked at Fowler one more time. "You represented this as clean. Whatever comes out of this, I'm looking at you." The title officer closed her folder with a finality that said everything. "This closing is suspended. I'm going to need everyone's contact information for the record." My son-in-law said my name again, louder this time. He'd pushed back his chair. He said, "Dad, we can talk about this. Whatever you think happened, let's just..." I looked at him across the table. I let it run long enough that he stopped talking. I said, "You broke into my cabinet. You put your name on a document with my forged signature. You sat in my dining room and told my daughter that if I objected, you would call me a confused old man to anyone who'd listen. Those are not misunderstandings. Those are choices, and there are consequences for them." He said, "I'm still your..." I said, "You were my son-in-law." Past tense was a choice, too. My daughter was crying now, quietly, in a way that might have looked genuine if I hadn't watched her practice that specific expression since she was a teenager. I looked at her for a moment and felt something I hadn't fully prepared for. Not anger, not satisfaction, but a deep and specific grief for the version of her I'd believed in for 63 years. That version hadn't been entirely fictional, but it hadn't been the whole truth. And I had spent 31 years learning that partial truths are still lies. I said, "I love you. That hasn't changed and it won't. But loving someone doesn't mean letting them take what isn't theirs." She said, "Dad." I picked up my briefcase. My attorney opened the door. In the lobby, I stopped and breathed for a moment. Through the glass, I could see the conference room behind us, everyone still seated. The title officer on the phone. Fowler staring at the table. The buyer still reading the email thread with an expression that had moved past surprise into something harder. My attorney said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Ask me in about a week." She said, "What happens now?" I told her. "Police report today. DA's office Monday morning. Civil filing to recover damages. Lock change when I get home. And I need to find a good estate attorney to clean up whatever else they may have started putting in motion." She said, "I know 3. We walked out into the Nashville heat. August, still sitting on everything, like something alive. Ruth was waiting in her car in the parking garage, which I hadn't asked her to do and which didn't surprise me at all. She rolled down her window when she saw me and read my face for a second. She said, "Justice prevailed." I said, "Justice required significant assistance." She smiled. She said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it. I said, "I will be." I drove home alone. Parked in my own garage the way I had parked there for 36 years. Got out, went inside through the kitchen. The house was quiet in the way it gets quiet when the people who were filling it with noise are suddenly gone from it. I stood in the hall for a moment and looked at the photographs on the wall. The same ones that had been there for years. My wife at the beach in 1994. My daughter at her college graduation, laughing at something just outside the frame. Family pictures from holidays that had happened the way I remembered them happening. I left them on the wall. I wasn't ready to take them down, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. The past doesn't change, because the present does. Whatever my daughter had become, or maybe had always been beneath the surface, she had also been the girl laughing at the beach and the young woman at the graduation, and both things were true simultaneously. And I was 63 years old, and I had learned to hold contradictions without resolving them too quickly. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the quiet and the late afternoon light coming in through the window above the sink. The criminal case moved forward over the following 2 months. My son-in-law cooperated early and fully, which his attorney told mine was partly strategic, and partly, she suspected, genuine. He was devastated by the emails. He'd had no idea. That didn't exonerate him. He'd still participated in the forgery. Still sat in my dining room and talked about manufacturing evidence of my decline, but it placed him at a different point on the spectrum. My daughter's attorney filed motions contesting the authentication analysis. 2 independent examiners, both certified by the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, reviewed the forged signature and reached the same conclusions I had, independently and in technical language that held up under cross-examination. The motions were denied. Garrett Fowler surrendered his license voluntarily before the commission hearing. His attorney sent a letter expressing regret and offering restitution of his commission in exchange for our cooperation in limiting his personal exposure. My attorney told me the terms. I accepted them on the condition that he provide a full written account of how and when he'd been approached, who had contacted him first, and what representations had been made about the legitimacy of the documentation. He did. The buyer in Atlanta filed a civil action against Fowler separately. That was his business. My son-in-law pleaded guilty to a charge of document fraud. He received 18 months probation, community service, and a restitution judgment he would be paying off for years. My daughter went to trial. She argued throughout that she had believed the power of attorney was legitimate, a story her emails to Atlanta made effectively impossible to sustain. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. She received 2 years probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent civil judgment that would follow her for a long time. At sentencing, I submitted a victim impact statement. I did not read it aloud. I handed it to the clerk and sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings with the same attention I had given to federal hearings for 3 decades. When it was finished, I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom for a few minutes. My daughter came out with her attorney and saw me. We looked at each other across about 15 feet of marble floor. She didn't speak. I didn't either. There wasn't a version of what needed to be said that could be said in a courthouse hallway, and I wasn't sure there was a version that could be said anywhere yet. Maybe there would be, eventually. Or maybe this was just what the truth looked like when you finally let it stand without a frame around it. I walked out through the front doors into October air, cool for once, the heat finally broken. Ruth was waiting on a bench outside, yellow legal pad on her knees, pen behind her ear. watching the pigeons with the patient attention she gave to everything. She said, "How did it go?" I told her. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "What are you going to do now?" I'd been thinking about that. I told her about a legal aid organization I'd found, one that worked specifically with older adults facing financial exploitation. They needed volunteers with forensic backgrounds who could review documents and help identify forgeries early, before transactions closed, before judgments were entered, before the damage was done. They told me I was the kind of volunteer they rarely found. I said, "Somebody has to do it." Ruth said, "That's true of most good things." We sat on the bench for a while in the October cool. The courthouse doors opened and closed behind us. People came and went. Nashville kept moving around us the way cities do. Indifferent and continuous. Full of stories being written in rooms where nobody's watching. But I'd learned something in 31 years of watching rooms where nobody was supposed to be watching. Somebody always is.